Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is a narrative game designer, team lead in the video game industry, working on games such as Neverwinter and Magic Legends. Please welcome Winter Mullenix to Epic Realms. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
When I think about games, personally, I think about myself growing up as a kid. Were you a big video game person growing up? What kind of games were you like super interested in, or was that not a thing for you?
I was always very heavy into video games. I've been working in entertainment since I was 6 years old. So a lot of the time I spent at home when I wasn't out doing auditions and stuff was just spent playing video games, kind of recharging my batteries. And so I started with, aging myself here. I started with the Atari.
Oh,
Um, and I remember falling in love with Crystal Castles and a few other games, and then Nintendo RPGs really caught my interest. Everything from Legend of the White Lion and Final Fantasy Chrysalis, even down to Deadly Towers. I liked that. Wow, I'm really aging myself. Time flies.
right, right. Did you when you were growing up, did you enjoy writing and telling stories and stuff as well? Was that kind of part of your lexicon of growing up, or were you like out doing stuff and playing, or were you like lock inside the house and like I got this cool story or something like that?
I mostly stayed in the house. I would very rarely go out. Very strict upbringing, and then on top of that, the Hollywood thing, audition to audition. And then in addition to that, I was just sitting with my piano or playing video games the rest of the time. So I've always been into telling stories, as it were. I didn't realize I was doing it though. As a child, I just started
Right.
playing piano, writing music, and then that just became its own thing, and that led to games eventually.
Did school ever pose a either a problem or a help for you uh, in that time? And
In the
was it
storytelling arena?
what's that?
Do you mean like in the storytelling arena,
Yeah,
or
and
do
the
you mean?
storytelling and coming up with stories and building writings, things like that.
I never really had a very artistic education. I had a very scientific education. I was in, going to sound braggartly of me, I was in international baccalaureate courses. So it was all this advanced stuff that they were trying out where I was. And that was great, but it wasn't very artistic. And I was always very artistic. And yeah, so I ended up getting educated in evolutionary anthropology and primatology, not thinking that I was ever going to make a path for myself in games back in the day,
Right.
and taking that one in a million shot in entertainment in general. I wanted something to fall back on.
Okay.
So got educated in evolutionary anthropology. I was focused on primatology, sort of the group behavior of primates, and I was going to go to Madagascar and help with the conservation efforts over there, specifically with the prosimians and the lemurs and whatnot. But
I love
yeah, I
lemurs,
ended
by
up
the way.
getting me too, me too, and they smell like Fritos, just so you know.
Oh.
Yes, you spend enough time with them, you'll never want to eat corn chips again. Um,
When you mentioned going to auditions and Hollywood, can you tell us a little bit about that? Was that like something you chose to do and like I want to do this, or was it something where they're like you need to go do this from either school or parents or anything like that?
It was a combination of my father uh, putting that pressure on me. He always wanted to be like, well, successful in that arena. But he wasn't, and he pushed me really hard as a kid to do stuff like that. I ended up loving it myself. Not so much. It's hard to explain, and it's probably why I'm in games. I didn't so much like the attention as a lot of other people who were in that did. It was more about the expression and the fun of telling a good story for
Yeah.
me. So it was always a bit of a conflict for me. I was always a bit more intellectual, but I was also extremely artistic. but the intersection was kind of just conducive to that. So I'm the youngest of 6 children, so I was the one that was pushed for all that stuff.
Gotcha. So you also mentioned you went to school, college, primatology, stuff like that, but eventually you did modeling. Did that come before or after the primatology stuff?
That's what disrupted my education actually,
Okay.
because I ended up getting some modeling gigs. I don't want to say with whom.
Okay.
I don't want people looking for pictures and stuff because that's always embarrassing. But at any rate, yeah, I stepped away from college to take this chance because I'm like, oh, this might actually be my shot. And
Yeah.
I very foolishly thought that my scholarship would persist if I came back later.
Like it would just be
Don't
there
know.
forever.
I don't know why I thought that. Very ignorant of me. But I was young and I didn't
Right.
have the standard upbringing I guess a lot of people do. So it was an interesting sort of experience to be like, it's going to cost me how much? Well, that's not happening. I guess I'm done with that.
When you were talking about doing auditions and you said that you enjoyed doing telling the story as opposed to the attention,
Mhm.
why late did you know then that that was the case, or did it take you years to figure out that that's kind of what your feeling was on it? Because then to go into modeling, which is a little less story and a little bit more getting the attention, it makes me curious.
There was a period of time in my youth where I thought I really wanted the attention, but
Mm-hmm.
it's one of those things where you look back and you're like, was that parental influence? Was that me? I'm not
Yeah.
entirely sure because you're so malleable at that age that it's hard to say. Um, I've never been an attention seeker, but I've always gotten a lot of attention. So I've never really thought much about it outside of in the aftermath of going, this is more comfortable for me. This
Yeah.
is more where it feels like I belong.
Yeah. And you started writing
Even when I was
music,
on,
right? Too.
yeah. hmm
How does
Uh,
that
e-
how did that shift then? This is just like the broad spectrum of performance, which I love because I as a performer, I love this. Like I want to try this a little of this out, and I'm going to do a little of that, and because I feel like I've had a very similar journey when it comes to that kind of stuff. So going then from modeling to then, you know, music. Where's the shift there?
It was interesting. I went backstage and somebody wanted to talk to me after a runway show one time, and it was somebody from Sound Oasis Productions in Los Angeles, and they had heard some of my music, and they happened to be there. And it was one of those serendipitous meetings where it's just like, we want to talk about a publishing contract. I'm like, what? And I'm like half dressed and all this designer clothing. I'm just like, okay. And somebody's taking clothes off of me, putting clothes on me, and I'm just like having this business conversation. It was kind of a weird surreal moment, but
Yeah.
when it comes to a lot of those aspects of performance, if you want to be a storyteller, there is a lot of overlap
Yeah.
in the crowds. There was even a period of time where SOE was under the same umbrella as Sony Records. And so, at a lot of Sony Records events, you'd see game developers, and at some of those events, you'd see people from music.
Yeah.
So
Well, in music, a video game without music or without a score or without sound, you can't tell the same kind of a story if there's no sound or no music, right?
right, it creates the emotional movement that you need as a device.
Yeah. So did that help you writing music, doing music? You said playing piano when you were super young. Did that really help later when you were like trying to tell stories and work on these games?
It's interesting. When I first stepped back from music in the early 2000s, I was like, okay, what am I going to do now?
Yeah.
What do I put on my resume? Do I say I write music good? Like,
Exactly phrased like that.
yes, exactly.
GUD, not GOOD.
Right, right. They told me to get good. I got good. Please give me a job. Thank you. No, it was just a matter of not really knowing what to do. And one of my friends who created a game called Words with Friends, Paul Bettner, who is now working on Wildcard, was like, you should really put that skill towards writing eventually. And I started taking contracts and stuff, just writing for games as I could. And then eventually I got my first in studio role. I transitioned more over to community because for quite some time, many studios didn't really have that dedicated narrative role. Very few did.
Hmm.
And so it was like, okay, you're community, but you're also writing on the side. And then half the titles you work on, you don't necessarily get credit in both. You just get
Right.
your title there. And so people don't really know you're doing the work half the time, but you are.
Yeah.
Um, but it's still gratifying all the same. And when I got to Cryptic, they were like, no, 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 yeah, you belong over here. And then it just blossomed from
Yeah.
there.
Can we rewind? Because you said, you just started
Sure.
getting jobs writing for games. Like, how do you get your foot in the door? Does somebody say, hey, here's where you send out your ideas? Because it's not like, do they just appear out of nowhere? You get 30 game companies come up and be like, hey, we need you to freelance this one little thing for us. I'm assuming you have to like know someone, or you have to get your foot in the door somewhere. Your name has to get passed around that you can do this kind of stuff. How does that intro, very beginning uh, part work?
Well, when I was living in Dallas, I was always deeply entrenched in the Apogee Ensemble Studios offshoots and everything. I still keep in touch with a lot of them, so I always knew people. But no matter how well you know people, there's still a luck component and a sort of prove yourself component when it comes to the writing aspect, at least, especially if you don't have a traditional education as a writer, like mine's in primate behavior.
Right.
I mean, most people are like, how does that apply? And I'm like, it actually applies quite a bit. You'd be really surprised to see how those baseline sociological behaviors in primates and prosimians apply to humans as well,
Yeah.
down to and including the chemical processes in the brain. So it's fascinating. But um, I'm trying to think back. It's been a hot minute. I've been in this industry for like 20 years now. So
Right.
um, Linda Carlson from Sony Online Entertainment and I were friends, and she started recommending me for magazines
Okay.
first. I did that. I did end up eventually working with Paul Bettner over at Playful, and I was community specialist there, and I contributed a bit to writing as well. And things just kind of snowballed from there. A lot of people in games get their start at a company called Mod Squad, which is a
Yeah.
remote work company.
And they
And
do all
they're
kinds of stuff,
fantastic.
not just video games too, just all kinds of stuff all over the world. So
Mhm. They really do. They're actually amazing. They're if anybody's looking for remote work, I always recommend them because they're dependable. They are solid people, and I adore everyone there. Rich Weil brought me onto their roster. I started doing more community management and such there. That evolved into a little bit of writing in games, and then that evolved into contracts outside of Mod Squad for games, and it just snowballed. So it really started, I would say, with magazines, but it didn't take long for that to snowball for me.
right.
But it did take a long time to transition from just small contracts and stuff to an actual in studio role. I want to say it was about 9 years of doing that before I actually started getting in studio roles.
Right.
And that's just a completely different animal, believe it or
Yeah.
not.
Well, and you're writing magazines. What, you know, are you just telling stories? Are you doing tie-ins to games that already exist? What are you doing there at the magazines?
I was with Beckett, Massive Online Gamer, so I was covering a lot of MMOs,
Okay.
since they were kind of the genre du jour, as it was.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was just a lot of that and writing for blogs online, stuff like that. Just getting my name and my
Hmm.
writing out there in any format I could. I was trying to, at the time, kind of separate myself from music because music isn't, if you're a songwriter and you're dealing with record labels and publishers, you aren't always writing for yourself. So it is, I guess a way to put it would be that I wrote things that weren't necessarily genuine to me.
Yeah.
And so I was distancing myself from that and kind of focusing on like, okay, well, I'm not necessarily telling anybody else's story here, and I'm not trying to appeal to, just to put it bluntly, a more sexualized audience because music is hyper um, sexualized in the presentation, especially if you're a woman
Yeah.
in music and they're trying to control your image. So it was a very different experience. So yeah, I distanced myself from that, started really just building up a new portfolio of my own that didn't involve external input.
Right. Right.
And yeah, it just built from there.
That's awesome. So when you start getting into in studio type work, and that starts to shift from writing magazine articles and whatnot, and you said that you're kind of doing a lot of different hats, community and game and things like that. Give us a little bit more like in depth what that means to somebody who might not understand, because it's an industry with a lot of moving parts, and somebody might go, okay, narrative game designer, what does that mean, what do they do? Does that mean that you're like working on code or just talking to people, or actually like sitting there
Right.
with pen and paper and coming up with the script for the storyline? What kind of does that entail from you, and has that changed as you've done the role at different companies?
It's inherently different at each company, on each project, and with each team.
Okay.
So narrative design runs a very wide gamut. Essentially, it's about bringing everything together, grounding it in the world, and making it cohesive. But that doing that for an MMORPG, for example, like Neverwinter, is a much more laborious process than doing it for, say, a first person shooter without DLC content or more of a gameplay focus. Of course, there are the exceptions to the rule. You've got like Halo and whatnot, which is very story centric despite being a shooter first and foremost.
Right.
Um, but it completely depends on the needs of the game, the team, so on and so forth. I always urge companies to lean a little more heavily into narrative because you can always tell when a game has different aspects that are created in their own sort of silos, as it were. Uh, you need the design and the narrative to work together if you want it to land with the audience the way you want it to land. And if you just apply it as a narrative wrapper, which is a term I really don't like, narrative wrapper, if you just apply it as a narrative wrapper to the outside of it and it's just a thin veneer, sometimes it's not enough to keep people interested unless
Yeah.
the gameplay is absolutely stellar.
Yeah. That makes total sense.
So it's hard to say what the daily is like. Myself, I am a writer first and foremost. I do have some technical skills. But when I was at Cryptic, I did everything from um, writing update outlines, running those by the IP holders, um, reworking them if necessary, working with collaborators. Like I worked with R.A. Salvatore on Neverwinter,
Yeah.
and some of the stuff we wrote together actually made it into his last book trilogy, which was very,
Which
very
is awesome.
flattering.
Yeah. We had him
Yeah,
on the
it felt
show, and he's
great.
he's a, he's a great guy. And
I
we
love
talked a little
Bob.
bit about his work on Neverwinter too. So him and
Yeah, I
Gino.
love Bob. Yeah, oh yeah, and Gino's wonderful too. They are just two of the nicest people, and I've actually known them a very long time. I interviewed when they were working on Project Copernicus a long time ago.
Oh, okay.
Um, and while that didn't pan out for reasons, uh, we kept in touch, and they are just two of my favorite people in the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. What were some, you know, big misconceptions that you had previously? Because you grew up with video games, playing them and whatnot, and then eventually slowly getting into the industry. Were there misconceptions you had beforehand that, looking back now, you're like, wow, I can't believe I thought that?
Going from more the Hollywood theme to video games, I assumed everything had a dedicated writer.
Okay. Okay.
Um, and I was proven wrong very quickly. Uh, but I would say no, when I first got into in studio roles and whatnot, people were always like, not to get too much into the nitty gritty of it, but people are always like, the game industry is fantastic. It's great. It's creative, but there's also like, be careful where you choose to work, so on and so forth. You never know what the culture is like. And I'm just
Yeah.
like, this is so much better than record labels. I'll just leave it at that. Um, and that's not to dismiss anybody's journey or anything. That's just to say, um, I think I was pleasantly surprised
Okay.
because a lot of people I know had very negative experiences in games,
Yeah.
just as a lot of people had very positive experiences. And I feel like I was well prepared for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think there's any misconceptions that the general audience, the video gamers of the world have about the way a game is put together?
I think there are several, and I don't think that's necessarily the fault of the players in any capacity. Um, So when you're working in different forms of media, everything has a very different turnaround time. And every game is developed differently. Sometimes the teams are in silos, sometimes they're working collaboratively, and sometimes narrative is shoehorned in later. Sometimes gameplay elements are shoehorned in later if the story comes first. It completely depends. And the way it all comes together directly impacts the final product. And so a lot of people tend to approach all video games the blanket sort of approach without an awareness of the development of the product. Um, and a lot of the time, people will think that designers made a certain choice or whatnot, but sometimes those come down from hire or they come down from, an IP holder, or if you're building a new IP, it comes down to wanting to build out a strong baseline before going any further. So many various things happen that I think there's a misunderstanding between, I think the deepest misunderstanding comes with one, well, two things. How much power each individual designer has within the product. It's very easy to point fingers and blame. And, at the same time, if somebody hasn't worked in the business, you can't expect them to have the same
Right.
experience or knowledge. So they're coming at you blindly, and you have to have patience with that, which can be hard for some game developers.
Yeah.
Having worked in community as well, I'm very used to it. I would say the other one is pricing. Pricing seems very arbitrary to people, but oftentimes it's anything but. Sometimes it's a matter of having to meet a certain number for, investors, or a certain number for the studio's overhead or whatever. And when there are live updates and whatnot, a lot of the time people don't want to pay extra for those, but sometimes the overhead for that makes it so that it's impossible not to release it with a fee.
Yeah.
And that's not something players should have to think about necessarily, but it is something that game developers deal with that a lot of players might not be aware of. So that when they're releasing something, it's not like, a lot of the time, it's not like people are trying to be predatory with business models and whatnot. You've got to keep up with
Right.
the trends, but you also have to keep the lights on in your studio.
Yeah.
And that's not as straightforward as it seems.
And maybe have a little bit in the back in case something goes wrong on the next project, or whatever, little you know keep yourself safe.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are seeing that now with the past 2 years, I want to say, basically, of layoffs and everything. I was laid off from Cryptic in November, just as part of the reorganization
Yeah.
over at Embracer. And yeah, it's just like things like that happen all the time. It happens in just about every aspect of entertainment.
Yeah, for sure.
The difference is that instead of modeling, I can eat donuts now if I want to.
Gluten-free donuts for people listening. No.
I'm a fan.
So you were talking about IP a little bit, and I'm kind of curious, and I want to kind of branch off on that. And because you talked about IP, and we talked about Bob Salvatore and Neverwinter, when you're putting together something, did you I'm assuming you didn't come in at the ground floor of Neverwinter. Am I correct on that?
I did not come in on the ground floor. It had been out. Let's see, I came in about 5 years ago and started helping out with the writing.
So when you come in, how do you balance, you're dealing with the world of Forgotten Realms, the world created by Ed Greenwood, fleshed out by so many authors and storytellers, and try to fit them in this game of Neverwinter, where you can have these little cameos but still tell a really good story in the Forgotten Realms world. How do you keep track of everything from the previous Baldur's Gate games, the stuff that's in the novels, working with characters, you're in this world, when you get expansions for places where they go to places like Chult, stuff like that. How do you balance all of that stuff and still try and keep it as canon as possible and keep it to the IP?
There,
It's a long question.
uh, it's a good question, and there are a lot of moving parts to it. And in my case personally, I am on the spectrum, and I have a very um, good recollection of lore in just about anything I read. And I started reading, Bob's work when I was young.
Okay.
Same with Ed Greenwood, and I grew up on it. I sort of came into Dungeons and Dragons at the end of the Satanic Panic
Yeah.
that pervaded the late 70s, early 80s. And even though I was just a little kid, I just immersed myself in it. So it wasn't too much of a stretch for me to keep track of things. I'd played through the additions and everything from having to calculate THACO. Oh, memories to,
Memories or
5e.
nightmares, whichever you want to.
I mean, it's open to
I'm bad at
interpretation.
math, so it was horrible for me. I mean, I still
I'm
I still roll the dice and go, "Hey, what did I get, guys?"
All I'm hearing is that you loved GURPS. I'm joking.
That was my very first RPG system right there, actually.
I loved GURPS, but I also just got so bogged down in the math of it sometimes that I was
Yeah,
like, let's play something else.
yeah, that's yeah, for sure.
Um, but yeah, I didn't have too much of a hard time. I would say when you're working for a company, though, making sure that you're keeping track of all the storylines, how they connect, how the characters connect. When I first joined on to Neverwinter, they didn't have a dedicated writer or narrative designer to start, and I was writing for Magic Legends at the time, which is actually a much more convoluted IP.
Yeah.
Um, and I had a very easy time with Magic, and that's why they were like, "Well, you're a good writer, and you already know what you're doing here. Why don't you take over Magic?" And I'm like, "All right." And I thrived, and I got everybody telling the same story, and that was great, and I loved it. I mostly loved rewriting Squee to feel a bit more modern and to be a hero amongst planeswalkers. Um,
Did you ever play the card game?
oh yeah, I started with the beta edition
Okay, okay. So you
back
had a
in
little background knowledge
'94.
there as well. So coming into that, you had some fun stuff there, and as far as knowledge goes.
Interestingly enough, when it came to Magic, I was always so when they started adding lore with the Weatherlight um, saga and everything, I remember gathering with my friends to play it, and everybody else would be playing, and they'd be like, "Hey, it's your turn. You want to come in?" I'm like, "No, no, 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 I'm reading." And I'd be like reading the cards, and I'd be placing them on the table, and I'd be trying to put together the story and make sense of it, because it's just bits and pieces, and that to me was more interesting than the gameplay. But that's just because that's the way my mind works.
Right.
Yeah, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. I
Awesome.
enjoyed it a lot.
Tell us a little bit about some of the other places you worked with. You Robot Entertainment. You did some work with Sony Online Entertainment, and you mentioned that sometimes people don't know the stuff you worked on. Can you tell us some of the stuff you did work on that people might not even realize?
Some of it is NDA,
Okay.
so unfortunately
Besides
I
the
can't.
NDA stuff.
Besides the NDA stuff, I worked on Orcs Must Die. I worked on Hero Academy. I worked on uh, did some contract work involving EverQuest 2.
Okay.
A few mobile games. Thinking.
Well, you've
It's
done so
been
much stuff. It's hard to like go back. It's like, okay, let me pick out the ones that I can talk about and the ones I can't.
well, I'm also still writing music and working on my own stuff at the same time. So honestly, my timeline gets a little confusing for me,
Yeah,
which is interesting. I can keep the timeline of a story together.
no problem.
Great, no problem. But then I have to think about myself. I'm like, oh yeah, I exist. And it's just like this sort of like, oh, I got to get out of my characters and come into myself for a second and kind of make sense of it.
Okay. Um, well, let's talk a little bit about something else you work on, something that's kind of game related, but not. You also do voice acting stuff, coaching for voice acting, things like that, voiceovers. Tell us a little bit about that, how that came to be, because again, music, acting, video games, that seems to like put them all together into one little ball, and that's what we got.
When I was working at Playful, so when it's a little embarrassing to talk about this part, but bear with me.
Okay.
When I'm stimming, I sometimes make little voices and stuff, and I don't even realize I'm doing it half the time. And one time we were working on a game called Super Lucky's Tale, and they came to me, they're like, do that voice again. I'm like, what? And then it just turned into me voicing a lot of the creatures
Okay.
in Super Lucky's Tale, and it that just kind of evolved into something more. And I started doing auditions for VO. Um, Ended up doing some voices on Star Trek Online, Neverwinter, and Magic Legends as well. Um, yeah, it's been great. So when I was working on Magic Legends, I quickly moved from just being a senior writer to a narrative director because of my experience in entertainment and how I'm very familiar with getting everybody on board to telling the same story together.
Yeah.
And that can be a big challenge in games, breaking people out of their silos and pulling them together, being like, this is what we want to do. This is what the IP holder needs. This is what I would like to do. What would you like to do? Let's marry these things and make something that, well, something better than my cooking at least. And yeah, I really thrive in that environment. So yeah, I lost track of the question.
We were talking about the voice acting.
Yes. So when I moved into narrative direction, I ended up going into VO sessions for the different games and helping Michael Henry, the audio director, get everybody on board. Because sometimes if you just hand something off to an audio team, they're not as intimately familiar with the source material as you are, and you can't really expect
Right.
them to. So making sure that you're available and you're in the room with the voice actor and the audio team, you can really hone it together and just turn it into something amazing. We did a lot of work with Lonnie Manella, um, who is just fantastic. She does some of the most incredible voices I've ever heard, including like creature voices for horror movies and whatnot. And like when I was helping with the recording of voiceover for Naniula and Magic Legends, um, it's this witch that, is also a tree. And so she's got all these creaky sounds, all these sort of gross, wet saliva sounds and everything when she's yelling and talking. And Lonnie was like, "Oh, you need this?" And she's just like, "What?" And I'm just like, "Oh God, that was disgusting. Thank you. I love it." No, it was just so over the top talented.
Yeah.
Um, so and also got to work with like Jordan Reynolds, got to work with some we worked with celebrities regularly on the Star Trek side of things, and it was just a great overall experience. I got a lot of VO experience at Cryptic and a bit at Playful.
Yeah. Did you ever have an issue like, you know, fangirling over somebody coming in, an actor or anything like that, and you're like, okay, I gotta tap it down, and be professional here?
Honestly, when I was in music, I would be backstage at some pretty I don't want to name drop, but a
Yeah,
lot
yeah.
of big named acts and everything. And so I have a lot of friends who are still big name acts and a lot of friends who used to be big name acts back in the day. And I've never been really starstruck.
Okay.
I think the only time I can say I've really been starstruck is there was one time my publisher was talking to Kate Bush about
Okay.
potentially producing some of my stuff, and she was still a bit of a, going to sound very hipster of me, but she was so underground, as it were. Um, it was before the Stranger Things blow up of running up that hill.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, what? And of course she refused to produce my stuff because she's focused on her stuff and her art. But I was still just like, Kate Bush was contacted about my stuff. Outside of that, Jane Goodall is honestly
Okay.
the rock star to me.
And did you
People
meet?
who make the world a better place are
Yeah,
people
yeah.
I
And
aspire
did
to.
you met her?
I've seen her at a book
You've seen her
signing.
at a book signing?
I wouldn't even call it a meeting.
Okay.
I'd be like, "Hello, I love you." You know what I mean? Just
Yeah.
like that sort of awkward, like, "Oh my God, it's you."
Yeah. That's awesome.
I don't really get that way about like classical celebrities, though. I tend to lean more into people who do big sweeping environmental things and whatnot. Like Greta Thunberg, I'd be like thrilled to meet compared to a lot of rock stars I've met.
Yeah. What would you say is something that you had as a that you overcame as a big hurdle, and how would you advise other people in similar situations to tackle that hurdle? Because there are always people. Everybody I have on this show has something inspiring to tell, inspiring stories, and sometimes they don't even know it. And usually it comes in the form of overcoming obstacles. Do you have anything that you could suggest for other people that might be in similar situations to deal with?
So I can't say that it's something other people would necessarily encounter unless they're also in the community, but I am transgender. I transitioned fairly young and whatnot. And so my experience was not standard um, because I remember. So first off, that kind of will explain why I stepped back from music. In the 2000s, um, we didn't have the same presence in media that we do now. Media tend to focus on the more sensationalized and more controversial aspects of the community rather than just portraying trans people as, people.
Yeah.
So I had to combat a lot of preconceived notions, and I dealt with a lot of transphobia and a lot of pushback over the years. So I would just say never give up, believe in yourself, advocate for yourself, and remember that what you do now is going to influence later generations. So that's why I'm such a big proponent for responsible storytelling, because as a mixed heritage trans person myself, it's very easy to tell stories outside of your diaspora and do so inauthentically. You can do it well, but it's still inauthentic. So it changes my approach to writing, who I consult with, who I aim to work with at any given point in time. Because if a story needs to speak to a certain demographic more authentically than I can provide, I want to talk to somebody in that demographic or
Right.
hire somebody in
Right.
that demographic if possible. At the same time, there are a lot of legal implications there. You can't just say, I'm going to go for this specific community or this specific, any number of
Right.
variables and hire from there. But what you can do is you can try to make sure that everything is set up to be successful in that regard. So even if you're hiring people outside of that diaspora still, you at least have consultation at bare minimum, and ideally you are able to find people in the demographic to help you tell an authentic story. For example, you wouldn't want to tell a story about Tibet without somebody who has a deep understanding of Tibet and
Right.
the complex relationship with everyone else around them. And I couldn't just write that blindly, or it would be potentially extremely offensive to people. Um, and that's very important for me to keep in mind. And furthermore, I think we need to come out from under this sort of trend where, and this is just an entertainment industry thing overall, like a trend overall, where marginalized or oppressed demographics tend not to get the same funding as what we've already seen.
Yeah.
So it's a very subversive way that the industry has disempowered people from telling their own stories. And so it's kind of an Ouroboros that's slowly being unraveled, a cycle of like marginalization and continued lack of funding to keep them marginalized. People like myself, people like any other marginalized community, and just
Yeah.
keep their stories kind of down and palatable. But sometimes the stories aren't palatable,
Right.
and they can be made palatable, but they should be told authentically.
I think the work you're doing and speaking on, things and being open about it and helping other people understand, you help that next generation and have been for many years. So thank you for doing that. So
Trying, trying. I'm far from perfect, but I mean, um, I think there's so much work to be done that I'd rather be open to making mistakes than not learn from my
right,
mistakes.
right, for sure.
I think that's really the best way I can word it. It sounds nebulous, like I've done terrible things. I haven't, not that I'm aware of, but
Now I'm sure there's some critics out there that are like, "Well, this thing you did for this video game."
I mean, I'm sure somebody out there has opinions on me, either because I'm trans or because I'm part Mexican or because I'm part Polish or whatever. People always have their opinions, but you have to learn to fuel your creativity with it
Yeah,
and just use any feedback to get better. Um, the most negative feedback can be the most powerful tool,
yeah,
believe it or not, as long as it's constructive. But sometimes it's a matter of making it constructive because sometimes people don't know how to word it. That plays into that player game dev sort of relationship we talked about earlier, where they don't necessarily understand how the game development's taking place, but they can
yeah,
still give negative feedback or have opinions on something. They just might not know how to word it because they're not actively working in it,
right.
or they might not know the implications. So you have to take that with a grain of salt and be like, okay, they're being really passionate about this. It's coming from a place of passion. Sometimes it can get a little trolly, but let's be real. Who doesn't have at least 5% troll in them? We're in the era of the internet. Everybody likes a little take a stick and poke.
Yeah. I try not to. I try to slowly get rid of that, but every once in a while, especially when I'm, doing a live stream video game or something, or with friends, friends usually is where it's the worst, right? Where it's
Hmm.
like, well, I can get away with it because they know I'm not serious. Well, do they? So
Right.
it's always improving to get better and be better and learn to become a better person all the time. So I appreciate you and I appreciate you talking about that.
Thank
Let's
you.
let's shift to Wicked Fox Games. Tell us about this.
Yeah.
Tell us about what you're doing over there. How did you get over there? Give us all the information.
After the layoffs at Riot, um, a couple people at Riot started making a new company, Wicked Fox Games, and Carrie Hutchins, the CTO, reached out to me and she's like, "Hey, I like your roster of work. Let's talk." And we talked about it. And I started in February. Basically, we're a woman-led startup. Uh, we're dedicated to immersive and responsibly told stories that connect with a broader audience,
Okay.
and bringing gameplay to more people. That's as much as I can really say right now, since we are, in very early stages.
Yeah.
But I'm very excited about everything that we've got planned, and the team is just an incredible collection of ex-rioters. You got me from Cryptic. You've got makes it sound like, yeah, I'm so incredible. No. But we have an incredible team with veterans from multiple companies, multiple countries coming together with the same unified vision about the way we're telling our stories, the way we're connecting people with the games, and the way we are utilizing platforms in doing so. And it's been a lovely experience so far.
That's great. Do you have an idea when like the first year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year for the first like real solid game, or is that something you can't even pretend to guesstimate?
I can't guesstimate that at the moment. I think you would have to talk to the CTO or CEO for
Get
that.
them on
And
the show. We'll sign them up.
hey, I will gladly introduce you sometime.
All right.
Um, they are absolutely lovely people, and I adore them. And I I, I wish I could say more. I wish I could say more, but it's very exciting stuff. Just keep an eye on Wicked Fox Games because these are fantastic professionals, in, just incredible veterans with huge titles behind them, just coming together and just doing incredible things. I can't wait to show more.
I'm very excited. You'll definitely have to let me know when you have more information. We can talk about it and maybe even get you back, maybe get them on to promote it and talk about whatever they got coming out. I'm
That'd be
definitely
lovely.
definitely looking forward to that. Do you have any other projects? Any you mentioned you're still writing and music and stuff like that. Do you have any other projects or any other things in the works that you can tell us about?
I am considering releasing an album of my music without a label.
Okay.
Um, but I had some surgical complications a couple years ago that messed with my voice a bit. Um, I basically, well, no, I don't want to make anybody squeamish, but
Okay.
basically, I had some surgery that involved my jawbone, and I ended up in the hospital for on and off for 2 months. Um, I don't remember a lot of it, but my voice was altered. I have a little more vocal fry and a little less control of my registers now, so I'm not sure. It would be an adjustment.
Okay.
Outside of that, I am also working on a book,
Okay.
thinking about kickstarting that eventually. A lot of people have been asking me to, but okay, so I was that dummy who did the full first draft, read it, said, nah, I'm gonna start over. And I ditched it and I didn't save it. And I had worked on it for a year and a half. And I
Okay.
was just like, and then I'm just like, well, why didn't I just edit it?
Yeah.
I felt like I just wanted to take a completely different angle with it.
Yeah.
But still, there's part of me that's just like, I should have just edited it. But it's my first foray into the long form book writing.
Right.
So I made a newbie mistake.
So you're working on that again, or is it done, or are you just like still?
I'm working on it again. I'm considering doing a Kickstarter to fund some of the time on it, because when you're working in games, sometimes you don't even have time to play games as much as you would like.
Yeah.
And then, anything else you're doing is kind of falling by the wayside. But I have my publishing deal. I have to get 2 songs out a month. I need to continue work on my book while I'm also doing everything else in games. And
Right.
I
Yeah.
never sleep,
Sleep. What's that? Who needs sleep? Who needs sleep?
right? I
I need
um
sleep.
I just love writing and creating,
Yeah.
like breathing.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that works out, and with all the people that you know, hopefully you can get some eyes on, some people to spread the word. And if you get that Kickstarter out there, you've got a number of people that can help you get visibility on the Kickstarter and get that out there. So, and I'm
Hey,
sure
awesome.
everybody in multiple industries are going to be more than willing to help you out with that. So guys,
Yeah,
stay tuned for that. We'll hear more on all of those works here down the road, I'm sure.
I was actually talking to Bob about it the other day, because we talk regularly, and he was just like, "You really should do like a Kickstarter for your book and really push it, because publisher relationships aren't what they used to be when it
Yeah,
comes to books, and the the internet has changed the model for a lot of
yeah, it
entertainment.
has.
So
Yeah,
it's been interesting, and of course, having somebody like Bob giving you advice and feedback is just like
yeah.
it,
There's
it
so many authors out there that now they just don't even bother going through publishers because it's better for them as authors to just do it all on their own, and they get it into more hands that way. Um, they say it's a
get
lot
it into
more
more
work,
hands
but
with
it's
less,
so
well,
much more fulfilling for a lot of them. So
more control. I know Sanderson is doing it. Um, yeah, a lot of great authors are doing it.
yeah, for sure. Do you have any upcoming events, things you're going to be at, other shows? I know you were on a couple episodes of the Corner of Story Game with Gerald Ford in the past. People can go and check those episodes out. Other events, other shows you've been on or plan on being on coming up?
Right now, Wicked Fox is taking all of my time.
Okay.
Um, so I would just say keep an eye on Wicked Fox Games. If there's anything else, I would announce it on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it these days.
Yeah,
I
it's a little both. I
I
call it
still
both.
can't
I just say both. I say Twitter X.
like it's the I don't know. X to me just sounds so well, it literally sounds like a variable,
Yeah,
like an empty
it sounds
variable.
generic to me personally. Personally, it sounds a little just like yeah,
Yeah, Twitter just connected more to me or for me.
yeah.
So I don't know. But yeah, I'll announce it on Twitter if
Okay.
I'm doing anything. I've also considered doing a Twitch channel where I play through games and talk about what's working in the narrative, what's not working in the narrative,
Yeah, that would be
how
awesome.
it could be improved and stuff like that. But I'm not sure how much time I'd be able to dedicate to that since I'm writing so much right now.
Well, maybe if you want to dip your toes in the water, I can facilitate, and then you don't have to do any of the legwork. You can just do it on the side. So we'll
Hey,
chat offline and see what we can do for that.
that'd be great.
People can find you on X/Twitter at Winnifresh, WINNIFRESH, correct?
Correct. It's kind of funny because so my nickname is Win Win, and in the music industry, I had a lot of funny nicknames. And then anytime I did something more in the R&B spectrum, people started calling me Winnie Fresh. So it kind of stuck. I'm like, I felt like that was just a silly name, and I'm just like, it sounds like a really bad
I
DJ,
was gonna say it's your alt hip hop name.
right? It's just like, yeah, I don't know. It was just one of those things that stuck, but most people just call me Win Win.
Which they can find you on Blue Sky at WinWin
Mm.
at dot social dot blue sky dot whatever it is, but it's at WinWin if you guys want to find them on Blue Sky. So Winter, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you being here. We're going to get to the live stream Q&A session here in a little bit, but I wanted to say thank you and I appreciate you being here. It's been great. So much information. Hopefully people can digest everything you've taught us throughout this entire episode. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Everybody, coming up, we're going to be having Austin Grossman. He's a novelist and game designer known for books like Soon I Will Be Invincible and games such as Deus, Dishonored, and Epic Mickey. So that episode is going to be live May 20th. That podcast will be available May 21st. Also down the road, comic book writer Jim Zub. I'm talking with him. He's going to hopefully be joining us in the future. And the author of the new D&D Spelljammer novel. Yes, they're coming out with the D&D Spelljammer novel. Django Wexler is going to be joining us coming down the road. So you definitely don't want to
Oh,
miss
they're
any of these
lovely.
episodes. Please stay tuned with us. Make sure to click the follow button, subscribe, whatever it is you need to do to get notified when we have new episodes. Make sure to rate, review, all of those fun things. Push all the buttons. It helps us and helps our guests. So, for Winter Mullenix, I am Nick, and I want to thank you all for listening to Epic Realms.